Andrew Collins is a prolific author, researcher, explorer, and a wonderful human being. He resides in mystical Wiltshire in the UK near the amazing megalithic stone circles, and we are very fortunate and very honored to have Andrew Collins here today. A big Earthkeeper round of applause for Andrew.
Okay, right, thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I mean, it's a privilege to be here in Little Rock at this incredible event, which I love. And what I love about it is the feeling that everybody's part of a family here. You know, I felt it before in 2015, and it's the same this year as well. So that's great. And I also want to thank Graham Hancock for the incredible lecture that he did, which is very close to some of the work that you'll see here today. And we both agree that we complement each other's work perfectly. We don't always agree with the same things, but we're all heading to exactly the same goal, and that's the important thing. So, thank you, Graham. Okay, right, we have a lot to get through, so let's start with something really important. Where do we come from? You know, this is something which we don't really think about the consequences of, you know, where life actually came from originally. And the one thing that we do know is that life has been on this planet for around 3.7 billion years. But in the form that it appears even at this stage, it's very clear that it had been around for a very long period beforehand. I mean, it suggested anything from 4 billion years upwards. Now, obviously, the general view of science is that life just evolved in this primeval soup on the ground with, you know, various different components, almost in a Frankenstein manner, with, you know, lightning bolts hitting it, combining with certain amino acids and whatever to produce life. Okay. Now, that may have occurred somewhere in the galaxy, but it looks today as if the smart money is on panspermia. And this is the idea that life was actually brought here. It actually hitched a ride on the back of a comet or multiple comets or asteroids that have come here from somewhere else, possibly the edge of our own system, solar system, the Oort cloud, and that have been forced into this inner solar system through various different mechanisms that will trigger these, possibly even supernova events in the past outside our own galaxy, or certainly outside of our own solar system. But where they come from is not necessarily the point here. The importance is that we may well come from outer space. And as I will try and show you today, this is something that the ancients also somehow realized, and that they pointed in certain directions in the sky and said, there. Why exactly? There are multiple answers, but it seems as if this connection with the stars began not so much outside, but deep down in caves, probably at the time of the last ice age, possibly one of the periods of glaciation even before the last ice age, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But there are people going down in these caves, possibly spending long periods of time, not only living in their cave mouths, but also going deep inside them and doing their rituals and ceremonies and leaving their art on the walls. And obviously we know about the famous Upper Paleolithic art of the Magdalene peoples, but it was going on much earlier, possibly at least 70,000 years and arguably earlier than that. And it looks possible as if this deep connection with the cosmos began down there. It didn't begin outside. And how could that happen? Well, quite clearly, if they spent plenty of time, if they are perhaps using hallucinogens, if they're in states of sensory deprivation and altered states, then at some point, somebody is going to said, I think we didn't begin here, we came from out there. Now, when that happened, where that happened, we'll come on to. Now, I'm going to go for the jugular here, because it does seem as if one part of the sky seems to be of interest as much as anywhere, and this is the constellation of Cygnus. And it's generally represented as a bird that varies from culture to culture, from country to country. Some places it's a swan, some places it's an eagle, some places it's a hawk, in others it's a vulture, even others it's a bird of paradise, a magpie, a goose. But all of these birds have something in common. They're all soul birds. They're birds which are considered to be associated with the transition of the soul, not just in death, but before incarnation as well. We all know the story about the stork that brings newborn babies. Well, this is just simply a latter-day folk story that rolls around the idea that the soul actually took the form of a bird, and in some parts of northern Europe, it's not the stork that brings babies, but the swan. Now, it would also seem as if Cygnus was seen as some kind of point of primary cause, the point of origin, not just of the soul, but also of creation itself. And this begins certainly as early as 16,000 BC, because it can be found, for instance, in the famous cave of Lascaux in southern France, where around 15,000 BC, cave art was put in the deep well chamber, out of access of the most obvious parts of the cave, and on the northern part of the wall, they depicted these various components of a fresco, including a rhino, a bull, maybe an auroch, and this birdman who has an erect phallus, and we may well come back to why he's got an erect phallus, and a bird on a pole. Now, I'm not going to go into all the individual components because we haven't got details, but a German professor by the name of Michael Rappengluck of Munich University concluded that this area in the sky was not just that of Cygnus and the so-called summer triangle, that's the bright stars in the vicinity of Cygnus, but the reason why it was on the northern part of the sky was it was almost like an imaginary window through to that part of the sky. And what's also important here is that pole that you can see there represents what we call the sky pole, the cosmic axis, the axis mundi, the point of connection between this world and the next, the sky world or the upper world in shamanic tradition. And this is essentially what it looks like close up. You're not allowed in there today, but they've created this reconstruction. And there's the bird on the pole. There's the bird man. There's the bison or large bull there. But it's found all over the world, this connection between Cygnus and this bird of creation. This is Hamsa, or Kali Hamsa, is also known in Vedic tradition in India, and also found throughout Southeast Asia, where the bird of creation helps the creator god Brahma to bring forth the universe and the world. I mean, there are various different versions of this story. Sometimes it's said that his wife Sarasvati, whose vehicle is also the swan, commands that Brahma does this and creation takes place. In ancient Egypt, one of the creator figures is the Gengen-Wer, the great cackler, who's said to give out this call, this honk, that brings forth the universe and the physical world within it. We'll come back to Egypt, obviously. And amongst the Cherokee tradition in North America, amongst the first peoples there is a bird of creation who is Guis, please excuse pronunciation, which is the bird of creation, and he is associated with the constellation of Cygnus. Just like Hamsa was Cygnus, and so was the bird Gengen-Wer, the goose of creation, a vehicle or avatar of the god Geb in ancient Egypt. And as Graham mentioned earlier, Greg Little wrote this incredible book, The Path of Souls, that came out in 2014, which I was honoured to contribute to, the foreword and the afterword. And what this shows, and as Greg will bring out in full tomorrow, and as Graham has introduced, is that there is a very specific journey into the afterlife. And that afterlife involves, amongst other things, a journey through a duat-like underworld, a leap of faith from the horizon just before sunrise on the midwinter solstice into the Orion constellation, in particular this object called M42, the Orion Nebula. And this is seen as almost like a portal, an ogie as it's referred to, almost like a rip in the fabric of the sky. And this takes you along the Milky Way, or through the Milky Way, towards a destination. That destination is where the Milky Way forks. And at this point, as Graham pointed out, is a creature that does vary. Sometimes it's female, but sometimes it's male as well. But the thing that's most commonly associated with it is birds and bird feathers, called brain smasher or the skull crusher. And this is the judge that determines where the soul goes from this point, whether it goes into the afterlife, in other words, it enters the afterlife at this point, whether it's reincarnated or whether it's thrown to oblivion. This all begins at that point. And as Graham correctly pointed out, and Greg and I have also pointed out various places, and will do so again, is that these ideas are almost identical to those of ancient Egypt. And obviously let's look at the most obvious site of Giza itself, and begin by making a statement, because even though I believe that there is a possibility that the pharaoh may have been intended to be placed inside the Great Pyramid, or somebody of that rank, because there is a sarcophagus inside the king's chamber, to see it in terms of a tomb is a total injustice of what is going on, and that it would be better referred to as an ascension machine. You know, somewhere that quite literally the soul is projected into. Maybe even not through a journey, maybe it's an instantaneous process. And I believe it's something that is important, not just in space within 3 dimensions, but possibly in time as well. That's something that I'm going to be writing about in the future. And as Graham did say, obviously the pyramid texts, which are found in the later pyramids, not within the Great Pyramid and its neighbours, but slightly later, probably about 150 years later, they contain the spells and the journeys that the soul must take to reach the afterlife. And there's me laying inside the sarcophagus, trying to imagine, what this journey entailed. But there are many different things. I mean, even the pyramids themselves the pyramid texts are contradictory, but again and again it talks about the soul of the pharaoh or the deceased returning back to the womb of his mother. And that womb is represented inside the pyramid by the sarcophagus chamber, the sarcophagus itself, and almost certainly by the coffin. Certainly that's what the pyramid texts state. And that these are symbolic representations of the womb of his mother. Well, whose mother and who are we talking about? Well, the pharaoh becomes the god Osiris in death. And Osiris isn't just a god of the dead. He is the dead god. He is the god that is dead. That's why the pharaoh becomes Osiris, because he too has now entered into that state and must find his way into the afterlife. And that afterlife, as I said, is to his mother. Well, his mother, the mother of Osiris, is Nuit, the sky goddess. But it states very clearly in the pyramid texts that there is a journey, a very important journey, a journey that begins by going to the western horizon as the sun sets, and then an underworld journey through this place called the Duat, and then coming out on the eastern sky and rising up to Orion, the constellation that's referred to in the pyramid text as Sar. And that here he is received by not just Sar, but also his sister Sopdet, who could be identified with the star Sirius, which is essentially just behind Orion. So this all makes astronomical sense. And Orion receives the soul, but just like in the Native American journey, there is another journey to follow. And that journey seems to be towards somewhere in the north. Exactly the same orientation of the entrance tunnels, the entrance passageways, corridors of all the main pyramids that were built during the Old Kingdom, with possibly one or two exceptions, but certainly the ones at Giza. They're like gun barrels pointing towards the northern sky. And various interpreters, translators of the pyramid text have said that although it's very clear that Orion and Sopdet or Sirius is important, there is another journey involved going into the northern part of the sky. And it would seem that from various texts, this is where the womb of the mother Nuit would be found. So where is the womb of Nuit, the goddess? Well, she is generally referred to as a sky goddess, but she's more than that. She is the Milky Way. This was brought out in work by an American astronomer named Ronald Wells in the 1970s. He wrote a series of papers on this. And what he said was that she is the northern part of the Milky Way. She is that. She stretches from horizon to horizon in the manner that you see here. So you've got the stylized form of the Milky Way as it appears in the northern part of the sky. And here's Nuit in a classic form posed over there. And notice that in the area of her head, and remember this is not necessarily exactly, reconstructed and placed as an overlay perfectly, you would have the area of Orion, which would have been very close to where the sun crosses the sky at one part of the year, and the other part where the sun crosses the Milky Way in the other half is in the area of Sagittarius and Scorpius. But between the two, and where the legs, the vulva, the womb of this sky goddess would have been, are the stars of Cygnus. And I'm pretty certain, as Ronald Wells was, the astronomer, that the womb of Nuit is the constellation of Cygnus, and that this is where the afterlife would be attained for the pharaoh or the deceased. And this is a depiction of Nuit as a sky figure, one of four, two of the others being Orion and Sirius as Sopdet, in around 2000 BC, so just shortly after the Pyramid Age. And I think by this time she had actually even become directly associated with Cygnus. She was the Cygnus constellation. In other words, she'd been condensed down just into this one form. And you can see her here matching very well the stars as they appeared in the sky during the Pyramid Age. And there is an even closer connection between the ground and the sky at Giza, because if you're at the southeast of the plateau, only about 2.5 kilometres, you would see 3 wing stars of Cygnus going directly down into the 3 peaks, and they extinguish at a point where the peak would reach them and receive them. And what's so important about this, and this is the reconstruction of what you would see, here's the 3 wing stars as they come down. And this was work that was done by Rodney Howe, an engineer, through creating his own program using all available astronomical data and the very latest generated maps of the Giza Plateau. So this is not just a wild idea. This has been absolutely thoroughly checked out by an engineer whose word I totally value. And the interesting and most important thing about this is that once those 3 stars would have set, they would have gone under the Earth. And if you were at the same time to have gone above those 3 same pyramids, those 3 same stars match almost perfectly, not perfectly, but almost, the three pyramids in which those three stars had just set. So in other words, this alignment works not just in the horizontal, but in the vertical as well. What it means is it's three-dimensional. It's not just one-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. Now, clearly, there are other ideas that we all know about to do with Orion, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, I'm just saying that there are other alternatives and that there is a context of why they would do it and why they would be connecting these pyramids with Cygnus. And this is the best match that we've got of those three stars. The star Deneb plays a slightly different role, which I'm not going to go into today. But as Graham was saying, Giza itself in ancient times was known as Rostau, which means the mouth of the passages, which is a reference to the fact that there were caves at Giza. Caves which myself and Nigel Skinner-Simpson, a brilliant Egyptological researcher, discovered back in 2008. And we believe fully that one of the reasons why Giza became important in the first place was because it was renowned for the caves that were there. They were seen to be physical representations of this underworld, the Duat itself. And as Graham said, in the fifth hour of the night, fifth hour of the Duat, the soul encounters Sokar, who you can see standing here on this island, surrounded by water, some say it's sand. And as I say in my books, that Sokar is a representation also of the Cygnus constellation. So it all makes sense that this judgment, this entry into the afterlife, would involve the constellation of Cygnus at Giza. So where did these ideas at Giza come from? And for this, we have to go 1,000 miles away, I can't remember exactly how much it is, into southeast Turkey, to Gobekli Tepe. Now, this is something obviously I've written extensively about. There's a whole book written on the subject. And I first went there in 2004. I first learned about it in the year 2000. And I was writing a book by the name of From the Ashes of Angels in 1995, where I said that in the very area where Gobekli Tepe was being uncovered at that moment, you will find evidence of a lost high culture, some kind of elite that triggered and kick-started civilization in the Middle East and is remembered under names like the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, and the Immortals. And just a few years later, Gobekli Tepe is found at that exact spot. And even Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist that did so much work until his sad death in 2014, believed that the Anunnaki were the founders of Gobekli Tepe. And this is how it looked back in 2004, and this is how it looks today. I mean, it's what appears to be a sprawling mass of stone enclosures, which were originally built on the bedrock. The earliest ones are built on the bedrock. The earliest ones are the most sophisticated and the largest, by the way. And they've uncovered probably about 8 major complexes, but there's at least another 20 to be uncovered. They know they're there from radar surveys, ground penetration, work that's been done there, and there's probably many more smaller structures, perhaps as many as 50. And what you have here are the earliest, or some of the earliest megaliths anywhere in the world. And so what was going on here? Well, I mean, one of the key places here is Enclosure D. This is probably the oldest of all of them, and again, the most sophisticated, the most beautiful of all of them. And in the centre of it are these massive monoliths, 18.5 feet tall, anthropomorphic in appearance with arms round their sides. They've got belts on one of them. There's got symbols on it which are a matter of interpretation as to what they mean. I believe that they do relate to the comet impact that had occurred around 10,800 BC, and that this site was actually created as almost like a shortcut to get into the sky world to deal with the supernatural creatures that were coming in view and being seen in terms of the comets and that people had this fear that a catastrophe was going to happen again. It probably lasted for thousands of years, and that the shamans, the elites came together and said, look, we'll build you these monuments, we'll get you over this so-called catastrophophobia, this term that Barbara Han-Clough used to define this fear of further catastrophe that existed after this main cataclysm took place, the Younger Dryas event that Graham and Randall Carson have been talking about. And that this was one of the purposes. But where were they going? Where were they going in this upper world or sky world? Where was it projected towards? Well, right from 2004, even before many of the important monoliths were uncovered, only their heads were there then, and important stones had not been found, I started to work out that this was orientated towards the northwest, not just Enclosure D, but other ones as well. And that what they then found was these hold stones in at least 3 of the major and most ancient of the enclosures, of which you can see one here, this is the one in Enclosure D, that perfectly aligned between the twin monoliths. And what I felt strongly was that they were looking at something at the horizon, and I worked with Rodney Hale, the engineer, again. And we'll come to where that is in a moment. But I just wanted to show you this. It's just one of the findings in my book, the Cygnus Key. What we realised is that all of the key enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are all based on a 4-3 oval, and that this complies perfectly with the positioning of the monoliths, particularly in Enclosure D, and that the central line through it cuts right the way through the hold stone. And I don't think this is coincidence at all. It's not been picked up by any academics or scholars, but it will be, I promise you. And what Rodney Hale realised is that Gobekli Tepe's main enclosures were aligned to the setting, not just of the bright star Deneb, which Graham mentioned as important to do with this fork in the Milky Way, but of course the fork itself, because in many different cultures around the world, this opening, this northern opening of what's known as the Great Rift or the Dark Rift, was actually seen as the entrance into the afterlife. And the reason it was seen that this was the case is because many thousands of years earlier, the stars of Cygnus had been coinciding with the northern celestial pole, the turning point of the heavens from about 16,000 BC down to about 12,750 BC. Every night, when you looked into the northern sky, the Milky Way was turning around like a propeller on some huge, invisible, cosmic aeroplane, something it doesn't do and it hasn't done since that time. It would have been an incredible sight. And the hub of that propeller was the Cygnus stars, the cross, which is also known as the Northern Cross, going around and around and around. And I think a lot of the reasons why Cygnus became important to later cultures derives from what the people viewed and saw to do with the Milky Way at this time. There are obviously differing views on what this so-called vulture stone, Pillar 43, represents, and this is my account. Now, this stands next to the hold stone that I showed you. So there is a good possibility that it has some relationship to it. And on this is this weird-looking vulture you can see on the left. We'll see a picture of it again in a moment. Now, there are various other different creatures here, and it was a Archaeo astronomer by the name of Juan Belmonte who first realised that the scorpion probably represented the constellation Scorpius. But then it was Armenian researchers that looked at the vulture and said, that's our constellation we call Anjak. And Anjak means vulture or angel. And they promoted this online, and I picked up on it, and I thought, oh my God, I had no knowledge of that at all. And I looked into this, and I realised that the vulture was connected with Cygnus all across the Near East and also into Greek, within Greek Hellenic mythology as well. And the vulture is a primary symbol of the transition of the soul, and had been right from the beginning of the Neolithic Age, and arguably even earlier from that, for reasons which we won't go into, but it's to do with the the excarnation of the soul, the fact that the bodies were exposed to vultures that would pick them clean, obviously eat what they could take, leave behind bones. Those bones were then collected up and then reburied. But those vultures somehow became associated with the transition of the soul. And I think that this is what we see here at Gobekli Tepe. But what is this strange ball that we see above the wing? And also this strange person that has no head, but an erect penis. Remember the erect penis for the figure in the Lascaux cave? Well, my opinion is that that ball represents two things, possibly even more. Firstly, it's a symbol of the soul. In early Neolithic tradition, the soul was represented in abstract form by a ball. And this is what you see. The vulture is in many ways guarding that soul on its journey into the afterlife. And here is the person that head, that skull has come from. He's headless. And there's a relationship between the two of them. And this is something that Rodney Howe, the engineer, worked out. That's the colour picture of it. And this was the fact that in 9,500 BC, the line between the head and the stem of that stone perfectly represents, as best as you can, the local horizon. And that all of these sky figures are representative of astronomical constellations or stars in the sky, and that if the ball is perfectly synchronized with the northern celestial pole, then everything falls into place. Not just the horizon, but the line from that ball down to the headless man here. And that's what you see here. And so what Pillar 43 is a map of how to get to the afterlife. And that the vulture is the guardian of the afterlife. And these are ideas that are incredibly ancient, even at the time of Gobekli Tepe. Okay, when and how did our cosmic origins arise? Did it coincide with the rise of civilization? Well, Graham's already pointed us in this direction. I've not had a chance to go to the Denisovan cave myself, but we're planning a tour out there next July, and that hopefully will be my introduction to the site. But that hasn't stopped me dreaming about the place and writing about it for years now. I mean, here's just run through things. 22 levels, 1970s was the start of excavations. The different layers go back 280,000 years. Layer 11, essentially, is the Denisovan layer, dates roughly from about 70 to 40,000 years ago. And it's this layer 11 that's the important thing, because Graham showed this, and this is just an extraordinary piece of art. And it's the Denisovan bracelet. It's made of clariterite, and it was manufactured by Denisovans, and this is what's on the official statements relating to this, 60 to 70,000 years ago. And the next time we made stuff like that was around 10,000 years ago at a place called the Gobekli Tepe, which is part of the same culture as Gobekli Tepe. And this is what they also found in layer 11, although I think at least one of them may have come from a different layer, which we won't worry, but in the Denisovan layers anyway. And all of them have been identified as belonging to those of pure Denisovans. Denisovans that essentially have not interbred with anybody else as yet. And by the way, the Denisovans disappear about 40,000 years ago. We're going to go into who they are and what they look like. But that's what they found. And in 2012, it was announced that they'd managed to sequence the genome of the Denisovans from this tiny, tiny pinky bone here. In fact, only half of it. They sent the other half to another university who didn't even bother to reply, and that's apparently now been lost. But because of the work that was done, that had to be crushed and used for the purposes, so it no longer existed. But the important thing about this is that it tells us that the Denisovans were unique. They were not modern humans. They were not Neanderthals. They were closer to the Neanderthals than they were to us. but that there was a split that probably happened sometime around 700 to 800,000 years ago from a common ancestor, and that shortly after that, the Neanderthals split with the Denisovans, allowing the Denisovans to develop their own physiology, their own mindset, their own material culture, quite separate from that of modern humans and Neanderthals. And this is a distribution map. Forget the black ones, they're no-go ones, but the green ones and the red ones show the distribution of Denisovan ancestry, or DNA, in modern populations. You'll notice that most of them are in either southern or eastern or southeastern Asia, and obviously in Australia as well, some in North America, which we'll talk about. And so many people today have Denisovan DNA. Many of you in this audience may well have anything up to 6%. I probably haven't, because there is no Denisovan DNA in Western Europe. The closest is in Finland, and the reason for that probably is because up to 6% of Finnish background is Asian, considered to be Asian, and beyond the Ural Mountains in the first place. And we know that the Denisovans mated with the Neanderthals as late as between 90 to 50,000 years ago. You know, in other words, this was not some archaic event that took place 800,000 years ago. It was taking place in the area of the Denisova cave where they found this bone and tested it to be a first-generation Denisovan Neanderthal hybrid. So in other words, there weren't just the Denisovans and Neanderthals and modern humans kicking around, but these hybrids as well, who would have traits of all of them. So what do we know about the Denisovans' physiology? Well, the genome tells us initially, I mean, you know, there could be changes, that their skin was brown, their hair was brown, their eyes were brown. And also that the molars that they've discovered are huge, with chewing surfaces twice the size of that of modern humans. Now, when they were first discovered, certainly one of them, and this is on a Nat Geo documentary you can see today online, they actually thought that it was that of a cave bear. It was so big. And it wasn't until they looked at it closely they realised that no, this is from an archaic human. And subsequently, they realised it was from a Denisovan. And currently, we haven't got any skulls of Denisovans, okay? Although a press release recently teased the fact that there's a paper coming out where they have now found a piece of a skull, I presume it's coming out of the Denisova cave, which will show, and this is something that I've been writing about since 2014, that these guys were huge. We're not saying all of them were, but certainly some of them were big. But anyway, one of the reasons we know this, and seems to be confirmation of this, is that there are other jaw bones and fragments of skulls that have been found that they cannot get the DNA, the nuclear DNA out of it, to show and confirm that these are Denisovans. And one of them is the Pengal jawbone that was found off the coast of Taiwan. I think it was in 2008, although the date I think is actually vague. And this is massive, it's a massive jawbone. And they're not sure the age, it could be anything from 30,000 or even more recent, up to about 200,000. But the interesting thing about it is that it resembles very closely, it's been suggested it's Denisovan, that it resembles very closely the jawbones of a much earlier species that existed before even the modern humans, known as Homo heidelbergensis, of which the first jawbone of this human group, this archaic human group, was found in Germany, near just outside of Heidelberg, a place called Mauer, in 1907, and this is 600,000 years old. We know that the Homo heidelbergensis were in Europe. They were also probably in Asia. They were certainly in Africa as well. And this is the comparison between the Mauer skull, jawbone, and that of the penguin. They're almost identical. The size of the molars, everything, which tends to suggest very clearly that there's a link, a strong link, between the Denisovans and Homo heidelbergensis, which we haven't got their DNA to compare, so we can't confirm that that's the case. But DNA, mitochondrial DNA that came out of Homo heidelbergensis remains in this place in Spain, I won't try and pronounce it because I don't speak Spanish, showed that there was a relationship between Denisovan DNA and Homo heidelbergensis. And this is so important for this reason. And that's the fact that when Homo heidelbergensis remains have been found in South Africa, they're regularly over 7 feet tall. So these guys are huge, just like the Denisovans. So what did the Denisovans actually look like? Well, I think that this is as close as you're going to get. If you think of the biggest wrestlers that you can from any part of the world, this guy's from northern India, the great Kali, this is what certainly a Denisovan hybrid would have looked like. The jawbone's wrong. I don't think that the Denisovans would have had jawbones. They'd have probably been similar to those of the Neanderthals that were swept back. They didn't have chins like that. But you can see the relationship. And this is so important because you can start looking at mythology and legends that tell us stories about giants and what they gave to humankind in the extreme antiquity. I mean, and there are many legends of giants in the Altaic region, the very area of the Denisova cave, including the fact that they were the earliest ancestors of the modern human clans and tribes. In addition to that, they built the first stone houses, it says. They built the first irrigation. They also created the first bridges. And they also gave us music and musical instruments. All these stories are associated with Altaic giants that have their own very interesting stories and names. And I suspect strongly that this is an echo of the presence of the Denisovans in the area of Siberia in particular. And we know that they were in other parts of the world, obviously, but this is the area we focus, because this is the only area that we've got confirmed remains that we know for certain that they were there. And just in the past month, this has just been released. And that's the fact that, obviously, just as a recap really, that Denisovan hybrids existed. Denisovans were extremely large. This is now, it seems to be accepted. And also, and this is so important, that the Denisovans were more advanced than us, modern humans, and Neanderthals, when they disappear from the scene, probably in the area of Siberia, let's assume, although they could have continued on in other parts of the world before they disappear, more advanced than us. What implications has this got to the foundations of civilization and the search for a lost civilization? Incredible implications. Let's go back to some of the achievements that we actually know that the Denisovans did. There's this beautiful bracelet or fragments of it, as you can see. And as Graham pointed out, amongst the features of it is evidence of high-speed drilling. Now, this doesn't mean that they had electric drills or anything like that, lost technologies in that way, but what it does mean is they were smart enough to work out how to create a drill that worked incredibly fast, that cut through softer stone. And I asked a few people about this that would know, and they said you could probably use water and some kind of mill with an axle, with a stone, a flint or something that would be spinning with the water flowing, and that would actually do it. And that would work. That would actually work. The bracelet itself was probably worn by a female. It's not that big, so possibly it was for a child. And that the important thing about it is that it's high status. But there's more. The Denisovans created the first ever bone needles with eye holes. And what this means is they had tailored clothing. Arguably the earliest in the world, although perhaps the Neanderthals had it as well, and some of our ancestors. But this is the evidence of the earliest tailored clothing in the world. The discovery of horse bones and DNA inside the Denisova cave has suggested to some scholars that they may have domesticated and ridden horses. Let's point out the fact here that in theory we did not domesticate horses until the beginning of the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC. So you've got guys riding around here, you know, in tailored clothing, with beautiful jewellery, riding horses. I mean, what else did they achieve? Well, something that most people have overlooked, and only I found this out in an excavation report, is that they found within layer 11, the Denisovan layer, fragments of a musical instrument that must date to at least 40,000 years. And that they say it's a whistle because only small fragments were found, but it could easily be a flute. And if this so, this bears out the legends that the Denisovans invented music. And we'll come on to how they worked out all this in a minute. Stone technologies. This is a complicated subject. I'll go into it in my book, The Cygnus Key, and again in a new book that I'm doing with Greg Little, come out next year, called Denisovan Dawn. But towards the end of their time, in the area around the Denisova cave and in the cave itself, they developed incredibly sophisticated stone tools that would become the mainstay of the toolkit of us modern humans throughout the Upper Paleolithic period, all the way down to the Bronze Age. And it begins in the area of the Denisova cave. They also were long-distance traders. The clariterite used to create the Denisova bracelet came from eastern Kazakhstan, with a minimum distance of 150 to 200 miles. You know, we know that because that's where it's mined today. But on top of this, a large number of these ostrich shell beads have been found in layer 11. Now, whether they were worn around the neck or whether they were decorations for tailored clothing, we're not sure. But lots of them, they've come up at other sites just to the east and to the south of Lake Baikal, this huge inland sea. And that's very significant because there never were any ostriches in the area of the Altai Mountains. But there were in what they call the Trans-Baikal region, which is the area to the east and southeast of Lake Baikal. And there are various scholarly sources that are happy to accept that these beads, these ostrich shell beads, either the material or the actual beads themselves came from at least 1,000 to 1,500 miles away from the Denisova cave. So this is trading on an incredible scale that the Denisovans were doing. Okay, what legacy did our earliest ancestors, hybrid humans, gain from the Denisovans? And I think it's just important to point out that the fact that we know that there is Denisovan ancestry in a great many of us, that clearly they interbred with modern humans, and there must have been Denisovan modern human hybrids walking around. And these probably were the people that founded some of the earliest settlements in the region, you know, that were actually, you know, Homo sapien modern humans. Now, here's the thing. This is a map I've created for Denisovan Dawn, which is coming out next year. And this shows what we call the Denisovan line. And it's a line of contact between modern humans that would have been leaving Africa, going through the Saudi Peninsula or through the Near East, and heading eastwards. Now, clearly others were going westwards and encountering the Neanderthals, because that was their domain. But those going eastwards would seem to have encountered the Denisovans along a territorial line that runs roughly north and south, that would start in the Arctic North, move through the area of the Sayan Mountains and the Yenisei River basin, down through the Altai, down through Central Asia, the Pamir Mountains, and then eventually down through Pakistan to the area of Karachi on the coast of the Arabian Sea. And it would seem to be that beyond this line is where our ancestors encountered them, and this is where the interbreeding took place. And this makes sense of the fact that all of the ancestry in modern populations are all to the east and south of here. In other words, they were carrying that DNA as they continued their eastward journey until they eventually couldn't go any further. Australia, New Guinea, Southeast Asia, etc., etc., etc. And of course, in India, there's lots of DNA of Denisovans in amongst eastern and southern Indian peoples. And so this is important because what happens is that once the Denisovans have gone, more of our ancestors are still sweeping through, but now they're not encountering Denisovans, they're now encountering Denisovan hybrids who they interbreed with, and very gradually the Denisovan DNA, the ancestry, gets watered down more and more and more until it's only in the most isolated places of the Eurasian continent, which is where the darker circles, that's where they are. In other words, they've reached as far as they go, and some of those that have followed them haven't reached as far as that, so that's preserved a much stronger part of the Denisovan ancestry. That is interesting because, therefore, we know that there were a lot of people carrying Denisovan ancestry. So what legacy was passed on to our ancestors at this point that was then carried forward, perhaps for tens of thousands of years? Well, one of the most advanced settlements in the whole of this region, just to the west of Lake Baikal, is a place called Malta, spelled M-A-L''T-A. And this has produced incredible art from around 24,000 years ago. And although so far there is no obvious Denisovan ancestry, we have to assume that the closeness of this settlement and the various other settlements in the region as well that are lesser known would have had some kind of connection, communication with hybrids of the Denisovans. And this is very important because amongst the artifacts is something quite extraordinary, which we call the Malta plate. And this is a series of 7 spirals, all of different sizes around, obviously around the central one, with a hole through it. On the other side of it is these 3 snakes. And it was a Russian archaeologist called Vitaly Larachev, who's now no longer with us, who started to work out that all of these spirals related very specifically to solar and lunar events, celestial events, and that they related to cyclic time, whether it was on a yearly basis or a much longer basis, including, and this is where it gets incredible, is that it had a knowledge of the 54-year triple Saros cycle. Now, basically what this is that there is a cycle of eclipses which essentially puts the moon back at the same spot where a full eclipse can occur after about 18 years, but it's not exactly right. It has to wait 54 years to go back to essentially the same spot, and even then it's just slightly out, but it's known as the triple Saros. We know the Babylonians were aware of the triple Saros, and where they got it from, is a matter of speculation. But here it was, on the Malta plate dating to 24,000 years ago. How did this knowledge come to these people? But what's even more interesting is that the numbers on the Malta plate relate not just to the triple Saros cycle, but conjunctions with another obvious celestial event in the sky, and that's the precession of the equinoxes, that essentially takes 1 degree every 72 years. That's 2 parts of the sun for every 72 years. I think that's correct. And the numbers that are generated by the synchronizations of these 2 cycles are very familiar to us from sacred architecture and from sacred literature. I mean, for instance, we've got 72, 108, 54, 216, 432, 864. These are all numbers that crop up again and again, as my good friend Graham has written in so many of his books, that are found in every part of the world, from Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom in Cambodia, to Borobudur in Java, to Indian texts to do with cyclic time and the years and nights of Brahma, to Mesopotamian king lists, to mythology from northern Europe, to cyclic time in ancient Chinese tradition, and almost certainly many other places around the world. The same numbers cropping up again and again and again. 54, 72, 108, 216, 432. Now, obviously 432 is something that we also know is important to do with music and hertz, but that's something that's outside of the remit of this lecture today. And the important thing about this, particularly at somewhere like Borobudur or Angkor Wat, is that these numbers are reflective of the fact that these sites are seen as the cosmic axis, the axis mundi of the world, turning time. In other words, they're almost like frozen forms of time moving around, but the numbers themselves allow for you to envision that they're moving through some kind of invisible axis going down the center of them. And that Mount Meru was this sacred mountain of the north, or some accounts say in the center of the world. And obviously there have been various claimants to it, and I'd like to add one, which I go into detail as to why I do this in the current book, The Cygnus Key. And that's the fact that we've looked at the geomythical reality of different stories of giants and legends in the Altaic region, and all of them point towards one place. And it's this place called Agaki. It's an extraordinary elevated platform on the top of a mountain in the Western Sand Mountains, just to the northeast of the Altai, that's marked on its northwestern point by these incredible granite halls. One is 250 meters tall, the other one's 150 meters, and there are all sorts of stories about them marking celestial events, including not just the setting of the Milky Way and the stars of Cygnus, which can be observed on various photographs that you can see of Agaki online. But this is something that we've checked out, and we're pretty sure this is important, is the most northerly setting of the moon. So in other words, the moon, as Graham said, moves through this cycle and eventually reaches the furthest north it does, this so-called standstill cycle. And then it moves back for another 18.61 years and doesn't reach this spot until that point. It's another marker of cyclic time. Cyclic time is the key to a lot of this. And just to throw in a few more giant things, because the swan becomes very important now, because these giant legends are associated with the symbol of the swan and also the symbol of the goose in the area of the Altai Mountains. In Greek tradition, for instance, this region was known as Hyperborea. That's the original location. Geoffrey Ashe, in various books, brought this out. A British author, still alive today, is in his 90s, showed conclusively that Hyperborea was essentially the Altai Mountains. And here, according to one story, is the priests of Apollo, the origins of the priests of Apollo, whose main symbol is the swan, and the three sons of Boreas, who is the personification of the north wind, or extreme north, call down swans in this huge natural amphitheatre, and they join with them in song during their ritual throughout the day, and then at the end of the day they all fly off from whence they came. And these suns were said to be 6 cubits in height, which is 10 feet or more. I think that this is some kind of abstract memory of either the Denisovans or some of their hybrid descendants, and that the swan is incredibly important and definitely has been since at least 24,000 years ago, because back to Malta, where we saw this Malta plate, this incredible thing, is the symbol of the swan on a number of pendants, bone pendants, and the archaeologists that found these say that firstly, various of them were orientated when found northwest and deliberately buried. One was found with a burial of a child, and that they relate to the journey of the soul in its north-south, comings and goings, in mimicking the migration of swans and geese. In other words, they're saying that even as far back as 24,000 years ago, the soul was associated with a bird, and that bird was a migrating bird, and that almost certainly it was a swan or goose. And on top of this, it's written that, by these same archaeologists, that this is a representation of the earliest animism, the earliest shamanism to be found in the Siberia. And this interest in the swan, particularly the fact that it's found at Malta, to the west of Lake Baikal, is in the fact that in Indian Vedic tradition, the controller of cosmic time, in certain of the accounts, is the swan Hamsa, or Kali Hamsa, which means the swan of eternal time. And I'm certain that this relates to an age when Cygnus was not just the stars around which all of the heavens revolved in the northern part of the sky, and you had this incredible effect with the Milky Way, but I actually think that this is a memory of something even earlier, from one processional age before the time of the creation of Lascaux in southern France, probably to about 40 to 45,000 years ago, when Cygnus was once again top of the pile, and that this was the exact time, I believe, that the legacy of the Denisovans was transferred over to us, and that this was the reason why I called the book The Cygnus Key, because Cygnus is essentially the name of the constellation, but it's also just Latin for swan. So, mindset of the Denisovans, this is where it starts getting crazy. No, I'm serious. And this is everybody comes up and talks to me about what I'm about to say. Now, what we know is that the Denisovans passed on to us certain genes. Genes, for instance, amongst the Sherpas and the Tibetans of the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, that allows them to exist in high altitudes for long periods of time. The genes, the particular gene relating to this, came from the Denisovans, they now know, because they can see it. It's there within the Denisovan genome. Within the Inuit people of Greenland, and one must presume also those of the Arctic Canada, they have two genes relating to existing in extremely cold conditions. And these also came from the Denisovans, they now know, from the Denisovan genome, from interbreeding. And the importance about both of these things, by the way, is it tells us two very important things about the Denisovans. A, they must have spent incredibly long periods of time in high altitudes, and B, also in extremely cold conditions as well. And those are clues, very important clues, which are something, again, that I'm covering with Greg in this book, Denisovan Dawn, that's coming out next year. But what's also important is that the Denisovans have two genes that are recognised in modern medical science as triggering autism. Now, we're not therefore saying that the Denisovans were autistic, but is it possible that they were using these genes to create their own mindset and material culture? In other words, they possessed savant-like qualities that we know today to be connected with those on the autistic spectrum. And we're talking here about everything from calendar counting, the idea that you can give somebody a date in the future or in the past, doesn't matter what, and an autistic person will be able to tell you what day of the week it is. Or obviously the idea of just hearing a piece of music and then replicating it, or creating works of art without any kind of formal training. And synesthesia, the idea that you see one thing or experience one thing or one sense and it comes back to another. You hear, you see sound, colours, etc. They all begin to intermingle together. And I find all this very interesting if we're starting to look at the possibility that these ideas to do with these incredible cosmic numbers may have existed as early as 24,000 years ago. Is it possible that they were inherited from the Denisovans themselves, who were counting time, counting cyclic time, as part of their mindset across tens of thousands of years, and that the earliest hybrid descendants of theirs, they said, look, these are important numbers, never forget them, because they're important to do with the future, to do with prophecy, to do with the movement of the earth through space, or whatever it was that they said. And these numbers were 54, 72, 108, 216, 432, 864, for instance. And what if these Denisovans and their hybrids were also perhaps using hallucinogens and getting into altered states of consciousness? What if they were also the earliest shaman? What were they achieving in such states? Is it possible that with a savant-like mind, they could virtually turn themselves into super minds and gain cosmic insights that we only dream of today? And I think that this sense of deep connection with our cosmic origins is something that goes back to the time of the Denisovans and was passed on as a legacy by them to the earliest hybrid descendants. That's not just obviously modern human descendants, but obviously Neanderthal hybrids as well, and eventually, all of them mixing together. And I think that at least one of the places that they pointed to and said, that is important, that's where we come from and return to in death, that's where the physical universe began and the physical world is a result of, was the Cygnus constellation. But finally, and this is something that Greg and I will be looking at in the new book, was civilization gifted to humanity by the Denisovans? In fact, actually, this is what's in the Cygnus key. Actually, I'm confusing books. Because it's my belief, and I show that through various paper trails, if you like, particularly to do with stone tools, that end up at places like Gobekli Tepe and in Western Europe and in other parts of the world, can all be traced back to the Altai region about 40,000 years ago, to the last point that we know the Denisovans were. And that this knowledge eventually found its way from past the Ural Mountains into Europe, down along the Russian steppe, down through the Caucasus, across the Caucasus into Anatolia, until eventually it helps kickstart Gobekli Tepe just after the end of the last ice age, bringing at least some of this legacy into what we see today at Gobekli Tepe, and that some time, probably towards the end of the life of Gobekli Tepe, around 8000 BC, some of the people there continued their journey south into Egypt, where they established early settlements, which I show in the Cygnus key, have unquestionable links with Gobekli Tepe and that culture. And here it lay dormant for thousands of years. People coming and going, probably from the Near East into Egypt, until eventually, at the beginning of the Pyramid Age, something flowered. And I see the pyramids as the last great flowering, really, of the Denisovan legacy, certainly in the Western world. But anyway, doing this just very quickly, this is what I want to throw in here, is where else did the Denisovans get to? Well, Graham's obviously talked a lot about America, his new book, America Before. I look forward to that, and it's released next April. And we know that there is some Denisovan DNA in the Americas. Graham's talked about South America, but I concentrated on the potential of Denisovan DNA amongst various First Peoples and what's known about that, which you can see here. And it's too complicated to go into now, but one of the areas that it seems to be potentially important is around the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River area, on the borders between the United States, what is today, and Canada, particularly amongst the so-called Algonquin-speaking peoples, particularly the Ojibwa and the Cree. And this is really important because when you start looking at the mythology of these peoples, they have incredible stories to do with giants and also these beings, which we'll come on to in a second, but I know I've got one picture I want to show first. And of course, this is the whole idea of the fact of giants being involved with Native American mound building cultures. Various of my colleagues have written books on this subject. Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman, for instance, Giants on Record, really good look at this subject and show conclusively that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of giant remains that were discovered. And myself and Greg have looked into this. We looked into it in Path of Souls, and again in the Denisovan Dome, the new book that's coming out. And it seems unquestionable. There's a lot of academic papers that record the finding of giants. Well, who were they? Well, firstly, we know that they were the elites, because when discovered, they were the ones that were wearing all the rich goods, and they were the ones in the centres of the mounds with all the normal-sized guys around the outside. They were the elites. These were the controlling factor. And even down to the historical period, the chiefs of the different tribes that were encountered by individuals like De Soto were described as incredibly tall people. And I think that these are possibly related to descendants of Denisovans, in other words, Denisovan hybrids. And this is possibly how they might have looked. This was done by a friend of mine, an artist, Russell Hussain, trying to incorporate some of the archaic features into what we consider to be a Denisovan hybrid. But what I've become most interested in is the stories of what's known as the Thunderbird. Now, we know that the Thunderbird is a creature that was associated with the sky world. Lightning came from its eyes. It could flap its wing and bring about thunder. Now, this is in mythology, particularly amongst these Algonquin-speaking peoples. But what's so important, and I've written a whole paper about this, you can see it on Ancient Origins, is that these weren't simply mythical creatures. They were seen as shape-shifting giant birds that could transform into human form by removing their feather coats. Very clearly, we're talking about shamans, and even today, amongst the Ojibwa, the shamans are referred to as the Thunderbirds. And I find this very interesting. In fact, there's actually a caste of shamans within the Ojibwa called the Giza, who are seen to be wild shamans, and that they draw their inspiration directly from the Thunderbird. And I wouldn't mind betting, this is pure speculation, that there is a connection between them and the Denisovan legacy. And this is the book that myself and Greg have written and will be published next year. This is the cover that's been produced for it. Whether the publishers absolutely accept it, it's in the traditions, is up to them. But we think it's an incredible image, again done by my colleague Russell Hussain. And this is going to change things. But Graham's book is going to really do the business, I believe, when that's published next April. Ours is out in September next year. So there's a lot of big changes I think that's going to come in our understanding of the past to do with the origins of America, the so-called American Genesis, as we call it. But this is my book today. It's The Cygnus Key. It was on sale here. Sadly, every single copy was sold yesterday. But clearly, you can get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Sad, unfortunately, people just rushed and got it, and it's just gone. But obviously, my book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis God, which has been a bestseller, and people seem to love, is still available outside, and that has all of the stuff to do with Cygnus and the alignments there. Atlantis in the Caribbean, Laura Little bigged that up during her lecture earlier on. Thank you, Laura, for that. And there's just the advert bit. We're going to Gobekli Tepe in October if you want to just rush off there now. In just a couple of weeks' time, we're going back there. Cambodia and Java in March. All this stuff is on andrewcollins.com. And we're going, as I mentioned earlier, to Siberia, to all of the Denisovan sites, including the Denisovan Cave. We'll see the bracelet, hopefully, and go to that place, Ogaki, that I showed you, and many, many other sites. The site of Malta, this 24,000-year-old settlement. So if you want to come along with us on that. We do these tours, by the way, essentially to get us out to these places, in all honesty. So if you come on them, they are voyages of discovery. Who knows what we'll discover. And then there's going to be another Ancient Egypt one next November. But as I say, all on andrewcollins.com. So I think I'm done. Find me on Facebook. Find me on Twitter. Thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful.
Well, that's my first ever standing ovation, so I must be doing something right.
And we are family here.
If seeing meant that you would have to believe in things like heaven and in Jesus and the saints and all the prophets.
Yeah, God is great. Yeah, God is good. Yeah.
What if